When I first set eyes on Cypress Creek Estates, I believed my search for a peaceful place to call home had finally ended. Tidy lawns, shimmering sidewalks, and a large lake at the heart of the community lent it a postcard-perfect atmosphere. After moving around the country for work, though I rarely mentioned it, I was the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. I yearned for a tranquil respite from the pressures of federal oversight. I craved a place where I could sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and watch the world drift by. Cypress Creek Estates was established around a modest lake. Decades ago, it had been a small reservoir, but a forward-thinking developer transformed it into a scenic focal point for the newly built homes. Now, 24 houses lined the circular streets around the water, their pastel hues reflecting in its rippling surface. A slender walkway followed the shoreline, and a few wooden docks jutted into the water, perfect for fishing or launching a kayak. I moved into a charming Cape Cod-style home with white shutters and a wraparound porch. Over the following days, I unpacked carefully, occasionally pausing to watch neighbors jog or stroll along the sidewalks. Everyone looked friendly, and I looked forward to meeting them. On the third day, a small welcome committee rang my doorbell. A middle-aged man named Ernie, who introduced himself as the HOA president, offered me a folder detailing the community rules. He was warm, with an easy smile and a balding head that shone in the midday sun. "We're glad to have you here," he said. "If you need anything, the HOA is here to help." I accepted the folder and flipped through an array of guidelines: lawn upkeep, trash can placement, mailbox styles. None of it surprised me. HOAs often kept tight control to maintain uniform aesthetics. Ernie clarified that monthly dues kept the lawn services consistent, maintained the lake walkway, and funded small projects like the children's playground near the southern shore. Then, behind Ernie stepped a tall woman with precisely styled hair, wearing a crisp blouse the color of stone. She clutched a larger binder, lips set in a tight line. When Ernie introduced her as Ms. Marcia Arquette, the HOA's most active board member, she offered a slim smile. Almost immediately, she insisted I call her Karen. A peculiar nickname, she said, was just a running joke. Something about her sharp, assessing gaze made me uneasy, but I brushed off the feeling as new neighborhood jitters. Karen extended the binder toward me. "These are the Cypress Creek covenants in full detail," she said, adding with a brisk nod. "You'll want to keep up with them. Any unauthorized changes to your property should be cleared by the board, especially with regard to the lake." She touched on that last word with a certain emphasis. I thanked them politely, stowing both sets of documents in my foyer. After the pair left, I sank onto my sofa, exhaling. The house was lovely, and the lake was only a 2-minute walk away. But somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I felt a pang of worry. Karen's stony demeanor reminded me of people I had encountered in bureaucratic tangles. Individuals who loved the taste of power and fretted over trivial details. At the time, I chalked it up to typical HOA fussiness. I had no idea just how deep Karen's controlling nature ran, nor did I realize how violently she'd try to exert that control on the lake, and on anyone who dared challenge her vision of perfection. A week slipped by as I settled into my new routine. Each morning, I took a leisurely stroll around the lake, greeting the occasional neighbor. I spotted an older couple fishing from the north dock, their lines cast peacefully into the water. I made a mental note to bring my own fishing rod next time, excited to enjoy a stress-relieving pastime I treasured since childhood. Despite my high-profile job at the EPA, fishing remained one of my favorite escapes from the pressure of constant policy decisions. Late in the week, I encountered Karen again. She was standing near the east side of the lake, arms folded, surveying 2 teenagers launching a small canoe. She was accompanied by another neighbor, a meek-looking woman who nodded in agreement to Karen's rapid-fire criticisms. "The canoe's color doesn't match the approved color palette, and they're not wearing life jackets. This is irresponsible, and it's on HOA property." She turned, noticed me, and waved. "Good to see you out and about," Karen said, in a tone that suggested she was more interested in scolding the teens than greeting me. I forced a polite smile. "Hello again, Karen. Quite a view of the lake, isn't it?" She nodded curtly. "Yes, but we have to maintain order. People tend to forget that the lake belongs to all of us, so personal usage must follow established guidelines." She eyed my casual outfit, shorts and sneakers, and asked, "Going fishing one of these days?" I'd love to, actually. I saw a couple fishing on the north dock. Looks like a good spot. Karen's expression soured as though I'd mentioned a taboo subject. I prefer not to encourage fishing, she said in a clipped voice. It can lead to trash, leftover lines that entangle birds, or even irresponsible individuals who don't follow catch and release practices. We actually have a motion in discussion about limiting lake usage to certain hours, or even removing fishing privileges altogether. I felt my eyebrows rise. Really? That's unfortunate. Fishing has so many positive aspects. It's peaceful, it fosters appreciation for nature. Well, we'll see what the board decides, Karen interrupted dismissively. She turned back to watch the canoe drifting away from the shore. Her posture radiated control, as though this single vantage point made her the queen of the entire lake. I walked on unsettled. The irony was that, in my professional capacity, I oversaw regulations for water and environmental management at a national level. I'd fought for stronger protections for wetlands, advocated for responsible recreational usage of public waters, and testified in front of Congress about the importance of preserving aquatic ecosystems. Now, in my own private life, an HOA board member threatened to clamp down on something as benign as weekend fishing. Part of me found it comical. Another part found it disconcerting. I'd never encountered an HOA official quite so eager to micromanage every aspect of lake usage. Little did I know how far Karen was willing to go to ensure that her personal vision of an undisturbed lake, free from the nuisance of fishing, would become a harsh reality. Over the next month, I formed tentative bonds with many of the neighbors. Ernie, the HOA president, proved amiable and a bit overwhelmed by Karen's constant suggestions. He confided to me that she was tireless in her dedication, sending detailed emails about fence colors, lawn edges, and most recently, unsightly fishing rods. Other residents, like the retired couple who fished frequently, told me they had received multiple warnings from Karen about proper disposal of fish remains, even though they never kept fish and practiced full catch and release. Several dog owners complained that Karen had hassled them about letting pets get too close to the lake's edge. She thinks the dog's hair contaminates the water, one exasperated neighbor told me. I couldn't help but compare these stories to the kind of overreach and misinformation I sometimes encountered in my EPA role, where people with half-baked notions about environmental stewardship took it upon themselves to impose misguided rules. True ecological protection required scientific understanding, not random measures that might do more harm than good. At times, Karen's unrelenting micromanagement overshadowed the genuine beauty of Cypress Creek Estates. People were tired of her friendly reminders, in the form of fluorescent notices pinned to their doors. She also exhibited a certain arrogance, believing she was the sole guardian of the community's well-being. Yet no one confronted her outright. They tiptoed around her, likely fearing fines or further harassment. One Saturday morning, seeking a break from daily stress, I grabbed my fishing rod and a small tackle box and headed down to the lake. The sun was rising over the water, glinting through the cypress trees. A gentle breeze rustled the branches above. As I settled onto the wooden dock, I felt the tension slip away. I cast my line into the water and waited, letting the quiet calm of nature envelop me. For a while, I caught nothing, but I was content. The rhythms of the lake, the slight slap of water against the dock, the chirping of birds, reminded me of simpler times. After half an hour, my line jerked. I reeled in a small perch, admired it briefly, and then carefully returned it to the water. It swam off with a flick of its tail. I smiled, proud of the thriving fish population. But just as I prepared my next cast, a pointed cough sounded behind me. I glanced back to see Karen standing with her arms folded. She looked as though she'd just stumbled upon a crime in progress. "Good morning, Karen," I said evenly. She pursed her lips. "You know, the board is discussing a potential restriction on fishing. Ernie and I have talked about it. It might become official at next month's meeting." I raised an eyebrow. Why would the HOA ban an activity that so many residents enjoy? Fishing isn't causing any harm, especially if people follow catch and release and clean up after themselves. Karen's face stiffened. "Some people aren't so responsible," she replied, "and we can't risk harm to the environment. Besides, fish can attract predators like herons or even larger birds that might cause a mess. The water quality is at stake." It was difficult to keep from laughing at the irony of her environmental concerns, especially given my background. But I held my tongue. With all due respect, the lake seems perfectly healthy and robust. Banning fishing might be too extreme. She sighed dramatically. We'll see, won't we? Then she pivoted, marching off, her shoes tapping the dock with an air of finality. As I watched her go, I felt a flutter of annoyance. This was more than typical HOA fussiness. Karen truly believed she was an environmental authority. I wondered if her so-called concerns were a front for something else, some personal need for absolute control. Nevertheless, I finished fishing, collecting my things neatly, determined not to let her overshadow my day. What I didn't realize was that Karen was already planning her next move, and it would be far more damaging than anyone imagined. The rumors arrived in whispers. Several neighbors caught wind of new environmental proposals Karen had drafted, which she intended to present at the upcoming HOA meeting. The documents allegedly called for severe restrictions on lake access, with talk of banning fishing, prohibiting swimming, and even limiting the use of kayaks and paddleboards. The justification? Protecting water quality, or so she claimed. These proposed rules stirred an undercurrent of anxiety around Cypress Creek estates. Most residents liked the lake precisely because it offered recreation. Kayaking with a friend, paddling a small canoe, or catching a few fish on a sunny afternoon. That was part of the community's charm. Some neighbors worried that if they didn't comply with Karen's restrictions, they'd incur hefty HOA fines. Others thought the entire concept was nonsense, but they felt powerless to speak up. Ernie tried to quell fears by sending an email clarifying that the board hadn't yet voted on any new restrictions. But he also noted that Karen's proposals would be heard and discussed at the meeting. Meanwhile, Karen's personal campaign soared to new heights. She distributed leaflets door to door, urging people to support her lake preservation initiative, which was dense with jargon about harmful runoff, endangered fish species, and public health hazards. She dropped references to scientific-sounding terms, though in my professional opinion, her claims felt haphazard and contradictory. I was torn between the desire to step in as an expert and the need to maintain a low profile. My job as director of the EPA was demanding, and I often handled large-scale national projects. I preferred not to flaunt my title in casual neighborhood disputes. But it grew increasingly difficult to stand by while Karen peddled misinformation and whipped people into a frenzy over a problem that, from a genuine environmental standpoint, didn't exist. And so the day of the HOA meeting arrived. In the community clubhouse, a modest building near the playground, folding chairs formed rows in front of a small stage. Roughly 30 residents attended, some whispering anxiously. Ernie sat at a fold-out table with a microphone, flanked by 2 other board members. Karen was present too, binder open, expression resolute. After some preliminary announcements about landscaping budgets and minor bylaw clarifications, the time came for Karen's lake preservation initiative. She stepped up to the microphone, flipping through her notes. With an air of self-importance, she outlined her concerns. Fishing lines, according to her, caused pollution and posed a threat to local waterfowl. The introduction of invasive species, she never specified which, could degrade the lake's ecosystem. Boating activities stirred up sediment. Swimming was an invitation for pathogens to spread. My eyes nearly rolled. The lake, regularly tested by the county, was known to be in good shape. The fish were mostly bluegill, perch, and a few bass, nothing exotic. Predatory birds were part of a healthy ecosystem, not a nuisance. And as for swimming, the lake was rarely used for that, given it wasn't designed as a formal swimming beach. Others in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Ernie asked if Karen had data to support her claims. She rattled off vague citations of environmental articles and anecdotal evidence. A few bold residents, like the older couple who fished weekly, raised objections. They insisted the lake was healthy, that they always cleaned up after themselves, and that there was no reason to impose a blanket ban on fishing. Karen's mouth tightened. Irresponsible fishers might not be you personally, but there's always someone. It only takes one incident of improper disposal or the introduction of disease from an outside fish source. We cannot risk it. A wave of frustration swept through me. The lack of actual science in her presentation was glaring. I dealt with genuine environmental crises, industrial polluters, toxic spills, watersheds threatened by invasive species. This was nowhere near that. But before I could raise my hand to speak, Karen announced, I propose that until we have a thorough study, we suspend all fishing, swimming, and boating privileges. If you truly care about the lake, you'll agree to a precautionary approach. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd. One neighbor, an avid kayaker, tried to speak up, but Karen pressed forward, ignoring him. At that moment, I recognized that reasoning with her in a public setting might be futile. She wielded a kind of moral authority, painting anyone who disagreed as an enemy of the environment. Ernie asked the board if they wanted to vote then and there. Another board member suggested postponing the vote until next month, giving everyone time to review the proposals. Karen's frustration was obvious, but she couldn't overrule them all. Eventually, the board agreed to table the motion. Meeting adjourned, we filed out, tension lingering in the air. No one knew it yet, but Karen refused to wait for a vote. She was preparing a drastic, dangerous move that no one had foreseen. In the following weeks, life in Cypress Creek Estates seemed normal enough on the surface. Kids played in backyards, the mail carrier did her rounds, and neighbors did small talk at the mailbox cluster. Yet a subtle air of unrest brewed. People whispered about Karen's latest mania, uncertain how far she would go to push her anti-fishing agenda. Twice, I saw neighbors get into tense exchanges with her by the lakeside. On both occasions, Karen retreated only after lecturing them about the endangered bird species that visited the lake, a claim no one could substantiate. Ernie tried to maintain diplomacy, but I could sense he was weary of her fanaticism. Many homeowners quietly confided that they disliked the direction Karen was taking, but they also dreaded being singled out or fined for minor infractions. I tried to maintain my calm. My professional responsibilities at the EPA often consumed my weekdays, leaving me exhausted by nightfall. Yet on weekends, I made a point of walking around the lake, occasionally fishing a bit, taking in the tranquility. As far as I could tell, the water remained pristine, the fish lively, and the local flora thriving. I told myself that Karen's nonsense might dissolve if enough residents spoke against her. Unfortunately, that hope was naive. Late one Sunday afternoon, a commotion erupted near the lake's southern edge. I was in my garage organizing paint supplies when a neighbor, breathless, knocked on my door. "Come quick," he gasped. "Something's wrong with the lake. The water's changing color, and fish are floating on the surface." Shocked, I followed him at a near run. When we arrived at the shoreline, a small group of neighbors had gathered. A grim sight awaited us. The water in a corner of the lake appeared murky, with an odd grayish tint, as if a cloud of sediment or chemicals had seeped in. Near the shallows, a handful of fish struggled on the surface, gasping, some already belly up. Alarmed, I crouched down to get a closer look. The fish's gills were flared. They looked as if they were suffocating or poisoned. My pulse quickened. This was no natural algae bloom or mild event. Something toxic had infiltrated the water. From my background, I recognized the early signs of contamination, but I needed more evidence. Neighbors began to chatter, some pointing fingers at industrial runoff, others speculating about a chemical spill. Ernie rushed over, phone in hand, calling the county environmental office. A few of the older kids on bikes stared in horror, realizing that their beloved lake was suddenly dangerous. I felt a surge of protective anger. If this was an accident, we needed to contain it. If it was deliberate, my thoughts instantly turned to Karen's extreme stance on ending fishing. Could she possibly have gone so far as to pollute the lake on purpose? That seemed unthinkable, an act of sabotage that threatened not just fish, but also wildlife, pets, and even the local groundwater. Yet the harsh reality dawned on me. I knew from experience that misguided individuals sometimes used chemicals or toxins to eliminate perceived nuisances. Could this be happening in my own neighborhood? As the sun dipped low, dead or dying fish continued to surface. Some neighbors videotaped the scene, already uploading it to social media. Word spread like wildfire. By nightfall, local news outlets caught wind of the crisis at Cypress Creek Estates. From my vantage point, I could see a swirling cloud of suspicion forming. Everyone wanted to know what had tainted the water. Ernie set up makeshift signs warning people to keep pets and children away from the lake. A gloom of uncertainty and fear settled over the community. I hurried home to make calls of my own. My position at the EPA gave me connections to specialists who could analyze water samples quickly. Though I tried to stay discreet, I couldn't ignore a potential environmental crime. This had become more than an HOA squabble. It was a serious hazard. And if my suspicion about Karen's involvement proved correct, she had crossed a line that no concerned resident should ever cross. That same night, I gathered clean jars from my kitchen, slipped on a pair of gloves, and cautiously approached the afflicted stretch of the lake. The glow of a street lamp reflected off the still water, revealing more floating fish. The odor of decay and chemical tang was faint but noticeable. Most neighbors had gone inside to process the day's events, leaving me alone with the dark hush of the lake. After carefully scooping water samples and sealing them, I placed them in a cooler. The next morning, I shipped these to a trusted colleague at a state environmental lab who promised to expedite the testing. Meanwhile, Ernie confirmed that the county had also taken samples, but noted that official results might take longer. Word of the fish kill spread, with local journalists showing up to document the unfolding environmental incident. They interviewed residents, snapping photos of the dead fish piled near the shore. Outraged neighbors demanded answers. Was it a manufacturing spill from a nearby industrial park? Illegal dumping by an unknown party? Or something else? Karen remained oddly absent from the scene. A few people claimed to have seen her walking briskly along the lake early in the morning, inspecting the water. She purportedly wore gloves and a determined expression, but she gave no official comment, nor did she step forward to share any environmental concerns this time. Her silence was conspicuous. Meanwhile, Ernie tried to reassure everyone that the board would do its best to clean up the lake, coordinate with local authorities, and find the culprit. But the tension was high. The older couple who once fished daily were heartbroken, upset that the fish they loved were dying en masse. Parents worried about their children playing near the potentially toxic water. Pet owners kept dogs on short leashes, steering them clear of the shoreline. On the second day after the incident, my colleague from the lab called me with a preliminary report. She sounded alarmed. This wasn't just generic contamination or an accidental chemical spill, she said. We found traces of a known toxic compound used in certain agricultural pesticides. In high concentrations, it can be lethal to aquatic life. The levels in your sample are extremely elevated. This looks intentional. My heart sank, and anger flared within me. Intentional poisoning, I echoed. Do you have any sense of how recently it was introduced? She paused. Likely within the last few days. Enough to cause a rapid fish kill. This is no small matter, and if it leaches into the surrounding environment, it could pose a threat to local wildlife and pets. We talked further, deciding to keep the results discreet while I notified the county's environmental office. But my mind was already racing toward Karen. She'd been the one championing an end to fishing. Her manner was extreme, and now, with this pesticide-laden water, I began to piece together a horrifying possibility. She might have decided that poisoning the lake would deter fishing once and for all, without regard to the broader destruction. Professionally, I'd encountered unscrupulous companies that dumped chemicals illegally. But rarely had I seen a private citizen stoop to such a vile act on a community lake. If Karen truly did this, she'd face more than an HOA fine. This could be a federal crime. Yet I had no direct proof linking her to the act. Only her obsessive crusade and the sudden, suspicious timing. One thing was certain, I couldn't stand idly by. Even if it meant revealing my position and stepping into the fray, I had to see justice done. Not only for the fish, but for every living thing that relied on our local environment, including the kids who biked along the shore and the neighbors whose groundwater might be at risk. I ended the call, gaze fixed on the shimmering water of the lake. I felt a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, resolve. I was determined to uncover the truth and hold the culprit accountable, even if that meant butting heads with the worst Karen I'd ever met. The tragedy at the lake intensified, with new consequences emerging each day. Several ducks and geese that frequented the shoreline fell ill. A neighbor's Labrador retriever, which had accidentally drunk from the water, became lethargic and had to be rushed to the vet. Parents forbade their children from going near the lake, and some placed yard signs reading, "Stay away. Lake is toxic." Fear took hold, overshadowing any sense of normalcy in Cypress Creek estates. Local media latched onto the story, dubbing it the Cypress Creek poisoning. Cameras rolled as reporters interviewed distraught homeowners who lamented the environmental disaster unfolding in their backyard. The entire community rallied to help with the cleanup, using nets to remove fish carcasses before they decomposed in the water. Volunteers, guided by county officials, wore protective gloves and masks to avoid exposure to the toxic residue. During one of these cleanup efforts, I spotted Karen perched at a distance, her arms folded as usual. She seemed to watch with a mixture of distaste and denial. A pang of anger surged within me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I needed something solid, an admission or direct evidence, before I could confront her. My EPA experience had taught me the value of meticulous investigation over emotional accusation. Meanwhile, the county's water management team began a thorough analysis of the lake bed and surrounding soil, hoping to pinpoint the infiltration site of the pesticides. If it originated from a single spot, that might indicate a container was dumped. If it was spread across the lake, someone might have poured it from multiple points. Questions swirled. Why would anyone do this? Was it an accidental overuse of weed killer near the lake's perimeter? Or was it done with malicious intent? Rumors circulated that Karen had publicly ranted about getting rid of the fishers once and for all. Others whispered that she might have coerced a landscaping company to use potent chemicals. Some simply believed a random vandal was responsible. In the midst of uncertainty, Ernie convened an emergency HOA meeting. The residents gathered in the community clubhouse once again. The mood was far darker than before. People demanded accountability and wanted to know what the HOA would do. Karen stood up early in the meeting, all righteous indignation. "I don't know who's behind this heinous act, but I can assure you I had nothing to do with it," she declared. "While I do care about preserving our lake from harmful fishing practices, I would never resort to poisoning it." She spoke with a dramatic flair, casting blame on outsiders or unknown criminals. I studied her reaction, searching for any tremor of guilt. Her face remained composed, her voice insistent. Some neighbors glowered, obviously suspecting her involvement. Others looked uncertain, torn between her guilt and the unlikelihood that a middle-aged HOA volunteer would commit environmental terrorism. Ernie tried to quell the tension by calling for calm and promising to work with the county. "We will not rest until we find out who did this," he said solemnly. "In the meantime, the HOA will coordinate cleanup efforts, keep residents informed, and comply with county orders regarding safety measures." No official accusations were made that night, but the tension between Karen and many residents crackled in the air like a live wire. When the meeting ended, a handful of neighbors cornered me privately, knowing I had some environmental background, though not my full credentials. They asked if I suspected Karen might be responsible. I hesitated, offering only that the investigation should be thorough and no one is above scrutiny. Inside, though, I felt certain. The more I saw, the more I believed that Karen's intense desire to stop fishing at all costs explained this tragedy. I decided, then and there, to expedite my own investigation, leveraging the full resources of the EPA if necessary. Because if Karen truly thought she could poison a community lake and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Government specialists from the county and state began collecting evidence around Cypress Creek Lake. They tested soil samples, combed the shoreline for containers, and interviewed landscaping companies that had serviced the neighborhood recently. Meanwhile, an independent environmental team arrived, thanks to my discreet calls, to assist with water filtration strategies and wildlife rescue. I walked the perimeter of the lake, wearing protective boots and gloves, accompanied by 2 EPA colleagues who recognized me from previous state-level collaborations. We discussed possible infiltration points for the chemicals. One colleague, an aquatic biologist named Dr. Singh, pointed out subtle discoloration on some grass patches near the southeast edge, as if a concentrated solution had been poured in that area. It was too soon to draw final conclusions, but the theory gained traction. Someone might have dumped a potent pesticide mix along the bank, letting it diffuse through the water. That same afternoon, Ernie approached me quietly. "I've heard whispers that you have some background in environmental matters, more than you've let on," he said, eyes glinting with curiosity. "I don't mean to pry, but if you have expertise that could help us, I'd really appreciate it." I weighed my words carefully. While I rarely advertised my identity as the director of the EPA, the crisis demanded decisive action. "I do have some professional contacts," I admitted. "I've been using them to accelerate the investigation. Rest assured, I want justice for this lake as much as anyone, perhaps more. His shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. Any help is welcome. The board is at its wit's end. He glanced around, then leaned closer. Between you and me, a lot of people suspect Karen. Her hostility to fishing was off the charts. But we have no proof. If she's innocent, I don't want to wrongly accuse her. But if she's guilty, well, she needs to face the law. Over the next few hours, we documented more evidence of contamination. Dead amphibians, like frogs and tadpoles, began surfacing in some of the shallower coves, a chilling sign of how far the poison had spread. Residents were furious, collecting donations to pay for restoration efforts. The local newspaper ran front-page headlines. Who poisoned Cypress Creek? Public sentiment was at a fever pitch. Karen, for her part, maintained a curiously low profile. She claimed she had caught a terrible cold and was limiting her time outdoors. However, a pair of neighbors swore they saw her rummaging in her garage late at night with large containers and a funnel. They admitted they hadn't reported it yet, fearing retaliation. I encouraged them to talk to the county investigators, but they were hesitant, lacking direct evidence that Karen was pouring chemicals into the lake. Nonetheless, each new rumor stacked the deck higher against her. One critical turning point arrived when the county's environmental team discovered empty pesticide bottles in a dumpster behind the community clubhouse. The bottles matched the toxic chemical found in the water samples. They were partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence. This chilling discovery led the investigators to suspect an insider, since few outsiders would know to dispose of items in that particular dumpster. At last, the tide was turning. The puzzle pieces were coming together. Karen's extreme hostility, her rumored late-night activity, the matching bottles. Still, we needed a final link, a direct tie that would remove all doubt and prevent her from claiming she was being framed. I resolved to find that link, even if it meant personally confronting Karen. The poisoning of a lake, after all, was not just a neighborhood crime. It violated state and federal environmental laws. I steeled myself for the battle ahead. I had seen corporate giants taken down by EPA regulations. But dealing with an overzealous HOA Karen might prove even more unpredictable. Her sense of self-righteousness could drive her to desperate measures. One thing was clear, I was done watching from the sidelines. It was time to flex the authority I had worked so long to earn. The growing suspicion around Karen intensified. Several board members quietly began pressing Ernie to call an emergency meeting and demand a full explanation from her. A few wanted an outright vote to remove her from the HOA leadership if she refused to cooperate. Tension boiled beneath the surface, and Karen's reclusiveness only fueled the rumors that she had something to hide. As the environmental investigation continued, small but telling details emerged. A neighbor who lived 2 houses down from Karen recalled seeing her at the local hardware store the week before the poisoning, purchasing several large jugs of a powerful pesticide concentrate. Karen had apparently claimed she needed to deal with an invasive weed problem. Another neighbor mentioned that Karen had once bragged about having a surefire way to keep fish out of the lake, though at the time, they thought she was joking. One late afternoon, I decided to pay Karen a personal visit. If there was any chance she might confess or slip up, a face-to-face conversation might be the catalyst. She answered the door wearing a stiff expression, half hidden behind a surgical mask. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I'm ill." Her voice was nasal, as though she truly was fighting a cold or putting on a show. I greeted her politely. "Karen, I know you're not feeling well, but I've been hoping to speak with you about the lake situation. The poisoning is a serious crime. We're all looking for answers." She gave me a withering look. "I've already told everyone I'm as shocked as they are. I had no part in it. People have seen you purchase large amounts of pesticides. You've been outspoken about wanting to ban fishing. And now we have a lake full of dead fish," I said, choosing my words with care. "Surely you understand how that looks." Her eyes flashed with anger. "I bought pesticide because the weeds in my backyard were out of control. Is that a crime now? And yes, I oppose fishing because it's harmful to the lake's ecosystem. That doesn't mean I'd contaminate the water. You have some nerve accusing me." I took a breath, keeping my composure. No one wants to accuse you unjustly, but the community deserves transparency. If you have any information, like if you saw suspicious activity, you should share it. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I already told Ernie everything I know. Someone else did this. probably a disgruntled resident or an outside vandal. I suggest you look elsewhere instead of harassing me. Her hostility told me the conversation was over. She refused any further discussion, shutting the door in my face with a firm click of the lock. As I walked back to my house, frustration burned in my gut. Karen's behavior felt more incriminating by the day, but we were still missing undeniable proof. That evening, I updated my EPA contacts, sharing the newly revealed details. They confirmed that the State Environment Agency was cooperating fully and that, should Karen be implicated, charges could be severe. A sense of inevitability loomed. Either Karen was about to face the full wrath of environmental law, or she was an innocent scapegoat for a monstrous act of sabotage. My instincts told me the former was true, but a part of me dreaded the chaos that would follow once the hammer fell. Events soon accelerated. The next day, a county investigator named Joyce Kincaid visited the neighborhood, collecting final statements. We spoke at length, and I revealed my official position for the first time. She seemed stunned but pleased to have the direct involvement of the EPA director. "So you can ensure we have swift federal action if needed?" she asked. I nodded. "Absolutely. Once you're certain who's responsible, we won't hesitate. Poisoning a lake is a serious federal offense, especially if it threatens wildlife and migratory birds. The penalties are massive." Her eyes sharpened. "We have enough circumstantial evidence pointing to Ms. Arquette. If we find one more piece, like security footage or a witness, we can press charges." Determination filled me. I wouldn't rest until justice was served. And if Karen dared to slip away from accountability, I was prepared to drag her into the harsh light of the law. The time for half measures had ended. The next chapter of this crisis would be decisive for both the lake and Karen's fate. It was a balmy evening when the final piece of evidence came to light. A young teenager named Kai, who lived on the eastern side of the lake, stepped forward. Accompanied by his parents, he approached Ernie and me with shaky resolve. He had video footage on his phone, grainy but unmistakable, showing Karen near the southern bank late one night, carrying a large container. The timestamp corresponded almost exactly to the eve of the fish kill. Kai explained that he'd snuck out past curfew to meet a friend by the lake. He hid behind a row of bushes when he saw someone with a flashlight. Alarmed, he recorded a brief video. In it, Karen could be seen opening the container and pouring its contents into the water, then dropping the empty jug in a black trash bag. Although the lighting was poor, her face and unmistakable figure flashed into view when the beam of her flashlight reflected off the water. The video ended as she moved away. Kai had been too frightened to come forward sooner, fearing he might get in trouble for sneaking out. But seeing the devastation to the lake and hearing the anger in the neighborhood weighed on him. His parents, furious at the sabotage, insisted he show us the footage and hand it to the authorities. I watched the video on the phone's small screen, my heart pounding. There it was, the direct, incriminating link. Karen was caught in the act. This short clip would be enough to pursue serious legal action. No amount of denial or bluster could dismiss it. Without delay, Ernie contacted the county investigator, Ms. Kincaid, who hurried over to view the evidence. When she saw the footage, her expression turned grim. "That's Ms. Arquette, all right. This is more than enough for probable cause. We'll obtain a warrant, search her property, and charge her with illegally dumping hazardous substances." A whirlwind of developments followed. Police officers and environmental agents arrived at Karen's home the next morning. She answered the door in a bathrobe, looking stunned as they presented the warrant. They combed through her garage, rummaging through shelves and boxes. Eventually, they found partial containers of the pesticide in question, plus receipts from the hardware store matching the date before the poisoning. Karen erupted in protest as neighbors gathered on sidewalks to watch the spectacle. She accused everyone of a grand conspiracy, screaming that she was only trying to save the environment from destructive fishers. But the evidence spoke louder than her words. The containers matched the toxic cocktail found in the lake. Her hardware store receipt, the dumpster evidence, and the video footage all aligned. I stood at a distance, arms folded, an uneasy mix of relief and sorrow swirling inside me. Relief that the truth was finally revealed, sorrow that it had come to this. Karen was placed under arrest, her rights read aloud. She continued ranting as they led her away in handcuffs, neighbors glaring or shaking their heads in disbelief. This was no minor HOA violation. It was a major environmental crime, complete with felony charges. In that moment, I reflected on how surreal it felt. The environment was my professional realm. I spent my career fighting polluters and guiding policy to protect natural resources. Yet here I was, on an ordinary suburban street, witnessing a suburban busybody face arrest for the same kind of environmental sabotage I'd seen in more corporate or industrial contexts. Truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction. As the police cars pulled away, an eerie stillness settled over Cypress Creek Estates. The tension that had gripped the community for weeks felt as though it were releasing in a single exhale. Yet a monumental task lay ahead: healing the lake, reviving its ecosystem, and restoring the sense of peace that had drawn us all here in the first place. Karen's arrest reverberated through the neighborhood. Local media descended on Cypress Creek Estates, filming segments in front of her now empty house, which had become a site of collective shock. Talk of HOA Karen poisoning the lake spread beyond our local bubble, attracting national attention when a few viral tweets highlighted the bizarre story of a homeowner association official committing an environmental crime to stop fishing. For many, it was the quintessential cautionary tale of overreach gone terribly wrong. Inside the community, a mixture of emotions took hold. Some neighbors felt vindicated, particularly those who'd been harassed by Karen. Others were shaken, struggling to comprehend that someone they once greeted with a polite wave could do something so destructive. Children, who had grown fearful of the toxic lake, asked if it would ever be safe to fish or boat again. Meanwhile, the county's legal process advanced at a brisk pace. Karen was charged with multiple offenses: illegal dumping of hazardous substances, pollution of a waterway, animal cruelty, for causing the death of fish and wildlife, and more. Given that migratory waterfowl had also been affected, federal wildlife statutes came into play, opening her up to additional fines and potential prison time. It was one of the more severe environmental crime cases the county had seen in years. As director of the EPA, I liaised with the local prosecutor's office, ensuring they had all the federal resources needed to strengthen their case. I also coordinated the remedial efforts for the lake. Restoration specialists arrived to evaluate how best to remove the lingering toxins from the sediment. County workers began aerating the water, adding beneficial microbes to accelerate the breakdown of the pesticide. Volunteers organized a fundraiser to help pay for the cleanup, although a hefty portion of that cost would ultimately be charged to Karen in restitution, assuming she was found guilty. One bright spot was the sense of community solidarity emerging from the crisis. Neighbors set aside old grudges to work side by side, removing debris, testing water samples, and caring for wildlife. Animal rescue groups set up stations near the lake to treat any sick or injured birds. Slowly, the harsh chemical smell dissipated, replaced by fresh breezes as we approached early summer. I took solace in seeing residents rally to protect what they loved. The poison might have battered our shared lake, but it hadn't destroyed our spirit. I even saw the older fishing couple helping with the water sampling, anxious to see the fish population restored. The final piece of closure would come from the legal system. As Karen awaited trial, rumors swirled that she might seek a plea bargain, especially after learning that federal crimes of this nature carried staggering fines and possible prison sentences. Whether she'd cooperate or try to fight the charges remained to be seen. Either way, I hoped justice would be both swift and thorough. Walking by the lake one warm evening, I saw faint glimmers of life returning. A few frogs croaked along the bank, and small insects skittered over the water's surface. Nature often has remarkable resilience, given time and the right assistance. I prayed that the same would be true for the neighbors of Cypress Creek Estates, that we, too, would find a path to forgive, rebuild, and once again enjoy the serene water that had drawn us here in the first place. Summer unfolded with cautious optimism. Day by day, the lake's condition improved. The county's restoration efforts gained momentum, helped along by environmental nonprofits that donated supplies and expertise. Volunteers planted shoreline vegetation to stabilize the banks and filter any residual contaminants. Water tests showed that toxin levels were slowly dropping. There was still a long road ahead, but the trajectory was hopeful. Karen's legal case, meanwhile, became a fixture in local headlines. She initially pleaded not guilty, claiming her actions were misrepresented and that she only poured a mild chemical solution to control algae near the bank. That defense fell apart quickly under scrutiny of the lab results, which showed a potent pesticide known to be lethal in aquatic environments. With federal wildlife laws in play, her attorney scrambled to negotiate a plea deal that might reduce prison time. Cypress Creek Estates found itself at a crossroads. Many residents believed Karen should face the maximum penalty for her deliberate wrongdoing. Others, while angry, still felt a shred of pity for someone so consumed by her crusade against fishing that she ruined the very environment she claimed to protect. The board, minus Karen, convened to discuss potential civil actions. Several members argued for immediate expulsion from the HOA and a demand for restitution. Ernie noted that the criminal proceedings would likely address restitution anyway, so perhaps it was prudent to let the court handle the financial penalties. At last, a date was set for Karen's pretrial hearing. I received a subpoena to testify, given my role in securing the lab tests and my knowledge of the pesticide's environmental impact. Part of me dreaded seeing her in the courtroom, but I knew it was necessary for justice. The day of the hearing, I donned a suit and headed to the county courthouse. A handful of neighbors came to observe, wanting closure. Karen appeared in a crisp blouse, her hair pulled tightly back. She looked haggard but maintained an air of defiance. When the judge asked if she understood the charges, she responded tersely, "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutors laid out their evidence: the hardware store purchases, the discovered containers, the dumpster evidence, and the damning phone video from Kai. Even Karen's lawyers seemed uneasy. The case was overwhelming. When I took the stand, I explained how the pesticide destroyed aquatic life, how it posed a serious risk to both wildlife and pets, and how, as EPA director, I could confirm that such an act violated multiple federal regulations. Karen avoided eye contact, focusing on her folded hands. By the time I finished, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt heavy, as though the enormity of her crime hung palpably in the air. At one point, her lawyer requested a recess to confer with the prosecution. They huddled in the corridor. We could only speculate about the negotiations. By the end of that day's session, Karen's team announced she was willing to plead guilty to certain charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, potentially avoiding a lengthy trial. The precise terms would be finalized later, but it was a major turn. She'd gone from denial to pleading guilty in a matter of weeks. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a swirl of relief and sadness. This resolution would probably mean a large fine, restitution for cleanup costs, and possibly some jail time or probation. But no sentence could fully erase the damage she'd done to the lake or the trauma inflicted on the neighborhood. At the very least, we had made it clear that no one, not even a self-appointed guardian of the community, could commit environmental sabotage without facing serious consequences. Over the next few weeks, Karen's plea agreement came into sharper focus. The prosecutors insisted she plead guilty to at least 2 felony counts, one related to violating federal wildlife laws and another concerning the illegal dumping of hazardous substances. They also demanded that she pay full restitution for the cleanup costs, which, thanks to the ongoing restoration, had soared into the tens of thousands of dollars. Additionally, the agreement included community service and a period of supervised release. Word spread through Cypress Creek Estates. Karen would soon be sentenced, and the judge could impose additional penalties if deemed appropriate. Residents watched the developments with a mix of satisfaction and weariness. After all, the fiasco had cast a dark shadow over what was once a peaceful, close-knit suburb. In the midst of these legal proceedings, the community pressed forward with lake restoration. A specialized environmental contracting crew installed floating booms to absorb residual pollutants, while volunteers transplanted aquatic plants to help reoxygenate the water. Kids organized a bake sale to raise funds for local wildlife rescue, and neighbors lined up to buy cookies and brownies, eager to pitch in. One evening, I joined a group of neighbors for a lakeside cleanup. Even though official volunteers had handled most of the debris removal, there was still plenty to do. Raking up decaying leaves, checking for any newly surfaced fish carcasses, pruning invasive plants. As we worked side by side, I felt a sense of camaraderie that reminded me why I chose this neighborhood in the first place. "I never thought we'd be dealing with something like this in our own backyard," said an older man named Gene, gently scooping up a lifeless frog. Feels like something out of a bad dream. His wife, Gail, nodded. At least we have each other. And I suppose we owe you a thanks for bringing in the big guns, she said, looking at me gratefully. I had no idea you were so high up in the EPA. I offered a modest smile. I don't usually flaunt it, but I couldn't stand by and do nothing. This lake deserves better. Nearby, a teenage girl was carefully planting a native lily pad species, guided by an environmental volunteer. Other kids passed out water bottles to the adults, all working together. Despite the tragedy that sparked this unity, it was uplifting to see how adversity could galvanize a community. As dusk fell, the group gathered on the lawn for lemonade and shared stories about how they first fell in love with Cypress Creek Estates. Many cited the lake, its peaceful ambience, the gentle breeze off its surface, the chance to fish or kayak in tranquility. The wounds of the poisoning ran deep, but so did everyone's determination to restore the lake to its former glory. Before I headed home, I paused to gaze at the water. The surface rippled under a soft twilight glow. Though the fish population was decimated, the ecosystem would eventually rebound with careful stewardship. A small part of me believed that with time, and maybe a fresh stocking program, fishing could return. For now, we had to focus on healing. In the distance, the silhouette of Karen's vacant home stood dark and silent. The house was on the market, rumors said, though she wouldn't be around to oversee any sale. I wondered if she felt remorse or only anger at being caught. Either way, the lake's quiet presence seemed to whisper that nature always finds a way forward, beyond our human conflicts. We, too, would move forward, forging resilience in the wake of sabotage. On a humid morning in late July, Karen's sentencing hearing took place. The courthouse was filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and a handful of Cypress Creek Estates residents determined to see justice done. I sat among them, feeling the tension in the air. Karen entered wearing a conservative pantsuit, her hair pulled back, eyes downcast. The gravity of her situation was unmistakable. Beside her stood her attorney, who had negotiated the plea deal. Across the aisle, the prosecution team arranged their files in neat stacks. The judge, an imposing figure with wire-rimmed glasses, called the proceedings to order. In a clear, steady voice, Karen formally pleaded guilty to the charges laid out in her agreement: illegal use of a restricted pesticide and violating a key federal statute meant to protect migratory birds and wildlife. The lead prosecutor outlined the damage inflicted on the lake, citing scientific data on fish mortality, water contamination, and costs of environmental remediation. Then, the prosecution asked the judge to impose a sentence that would send a strong message against wanton environmental destruction. Karen's attorney spoke next, emphasizing her community ties, her previously clean record, and her misguided belief that she was protecting the environment by eliminating perceived threats. The attorney portrayed her as a woman who became fixated on a single issue, banning fishing, and made a terrible decision that spiraled out of control. He pleaded for leniency, urging the court to consider a shorter incarceration and more community service. Finally, the judge addressed Karen directly. "Ms. Arquette," he began, voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. "In all my years on the bench, I've witnessed many motivations for environmental crimes, mostly profit or negligence. But your case stands out as a twisted attempt at environmental vigilante action. Regardless of your motivations, the consequences were severe: extensive wildlife death, water contamination, harm to your neighbors and their pets, and a lengthy, costly cleanup." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "I've reviewed your plea deal, which requires restitution and community service. Let it be clear, the seriousness of your crime warrants a firm punishment. You chose to poison a lake shared by your entire community, putting children, pets, and wildlife at risk. This court cannot, and will not, excuse such behavior." With that, the judge issued the sentence: a prison term of 12 months, with the possibility of parole after 8 months for good behavior. A substantial fine exceeding $50,000 to help reimburse cleanup costs and support local wildlife rehabilitation. Mandatory community service following release, specifically in an environmental restoration capacity, supervised, given the nature of her offense. The judge concluded with a stern admonition that any violation of parole would result in further incarceration. Karen stood motionless, her face pale, eyes rimmed with tears. Her attempts at quiet stoicism crumbled under the finality of the judge's words. The bailiff led her away, and the courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs. Some neighbors exchanged satisfied looks. Others seemed subdued, as though still grappling with the surreal spectacle of an HOA board member carted off to prison. As I exited, a local reporter thrust a microphone in my face, inquiring about my reaction. I offered a measured statement. This sentence affirms that no individual has the right to commit environmental harm without facing consequences. I hope it serves as a reminder that protecting nature must be guided by genuine knowledge and respect, not reckless or destructive actions. Returning to Cypress Creek Estates, I felt conflicting emotions: relief that justice was served, sadness at the entire ordeal, hope for the lake's ongoing recovery. The stage was set for the community to rebuild, free from Karen's toxic influence, both literal and figurative. In the weeks following Karen's sentencing, Cypress Creek Estates found an odd sense of closure. Her property was quietly listed for sale, managed by a real estate agent who made no mention of the scandal in the listing. Behind the scenes, the house became a symbol of cautionary tales, whispered among neighbors who recounted the nightmarish fish kill and the controlling nature that led to such tragedy. Meanwhile, real progress was evident at the lake. The initial toxicity levels had dropped significantly, thanks to aeration, microbial treatments, and careful disposal of contaminated sediment. County ecologists recommended a plan to restock fish once the water quality reached safe benchmarks. They projected that within a year, the lake's ecosystem could be largely restored, albeit with a new generation of aquatic life. Residents found new ways to enjoy the space: walking the perimeter at sunset, hosting small outdoor yoga classes, or simply picnicking on the grassy banks. Though fishing remained prohibited until the restocking plan moved forward, the ban felt temporary and purposeful, aligned with authentic environmental science, not an arbitrary HOA decree. Ernie organized a community event he dubbed Lake Renewal Day, inviting a local conservation group to host educational stations around water health and wildlife protection. Families showed up in droves, kids painting posters about protecting nature, adults learning about best practices to prevent runoff pollution. A sense of togetherness infused the atmosphere, standing in stark contrast to the fear and division that Karen had caused. During the event, a few neighbors approached me, expressing gratitude for my efforts in exposing the crime and guiding the cleanup. One shy teenager asked if I could sign his t-shirt, saying he was inspired by my role as an environmental advocate. I laughed, feeling slightly awkward, but obliged, touched by the gesture. Perhaps the next generation would learn from this cautionary tale that caring for the planet means thoughtful stewardship, not destructive attempts at controlling it. A highlight of the day was the unveiling of a new sign near the lake's main entrance. It read, "Cypress Creek Lake, a shared resource, protect it with care. Restoration in progress." The sign's bold lettering and hopeful message resonated with everyone present. We paused for a group photo, smiling in front of the lake's shimmering surface. There was still a long road to full ecological recovery, but we had momentum, determination, and communal spirit on our side. That evening, I strolled along the walkway, the sky ablaze with a vibrant sunset. In the distance, I spotted a lone heron perched on a rock, likely searching for the few surviving fish. It struck me as a symbol of resilience, nature's ability to rebound, given time and respect. My chest tightened with pride for our neighborhood. We had faced a startling betrayal, but we refused to let it define us. Karen might have tried to eliminate fishing forever, but ironically, her actions galvanized a deeper appreciation for the lake. If all went well, in a year or two, families would fish from its docks once again, practicing responsible stewardship. And I would still be here, quietly ensuring that our local environment, and the national environment at large, received the protection it deserved. Summer faded into a gentle autumn, and Cypress Creek Estates found a new equilibrium. Ernie stepped down from the HOA presidency, exhausted from the turmoil, and was replaced by a bright, level-headed woman named Denise Chambers. The board, now free of Karen's dramatic influence, operated more transparently, soliciting real input from residents before any major decisions. Meetings were calmer, focusing on modest improvements like streetlight upgrades and repainting benches near the playground. At the lake, the metamorphosis continued. Slowly but surely, harmful residue levels approached safe thresholds. The county's ecologists and the volunteer restoration group hosted a small ceremony to mark the beginning of the restocking effort. They introduced fingerlings of native bluegill, perch, and a modest number of bass, ensuring that the species composition aligned with the lake's carrying capacity. Some children squealed with delight, watching the tiny fish dart away into deeper waters. On weekends, neighbors still avoided fishing, respecting the ongoing recovery. Instead, families picnicked by the shore, reading nature guides about local birds. A new dock was constructed, wider and more stable, ready for the day when fishing rods would be welcome again. Kayakers resumed their gentle paddling under the watchful eye of volunteers who monitored water clarity and aquatic plant growth. During one of my routine strolls, I saw an emotional scene. The older couple who'd once fished daily stood at the new dock, holding hands. The wife had tears in her eyes. "We can't wait for the day we're allowed to fish again," she whispered. But even this, just seeing the water alive, is enough for now. I joined them for a brief chat, moved by their patience and gratitude. It struck me how deeply personal the lake's health was to so many. In parallel, I juggled my responsibilities at the EPA, occasionally traveling to Washington, D.C. for policy meetings. The tragic Cypress Creek poisoning case occasionally surfaced in discussions about local water protection laws, used as an example of how even small-scale sabotage could have major environmental repercussions. A reporter from a national newspaper interviewed me for a human interest story, focusing on the bizarre circumstances that had led to Karen's downfall. I spoke carefully, emphasizing that while Karen's motivations were misguided, the root problem lay in a lack of genuine environmental understanding. Real stewardship involves science, collaboration, and respect, I explained. Any attempt to protect an environment by destroying it is obviously self-defeating. By late autumn, a crisp wind blew colorful leaves across well-manicured lawns. The lake mirrored the red and gold of the foliage, creating a breathtaking scene that reinforced the notion that nature can heal if given the chance, and if harmful interference ceases. Cypress Creek Estates was living proof of that, forging a new identity as a community that overcame sabotage through unity, dedication, and legitimate ecological care. Karen's name became a hushed topic in Cypress Creek Estates. Occasionally, a neighbor would comment on her sentencing or wonder about her mental state. She was serving her prison term upstate, and rumor had it she found no sympathy among fellow inmates. Some speculated she might write a tell-all blog or letter from behind bars, blaming the HOA for her downfall. But none of that materialized. Life, as it tends to do, moved on. The next generation of fish took root in the lake, forging a delicate balance with the rehabilitated aquatic vegetation. County tests showed water quality nearing normal levels. By the time the holiday season arrived, the board announced a soft reopening for limited fishing, strictly catch and release, with the guidance of the environmental consultants. A collective cheer rose from many households, thrilled to see this milestone reached. On the crisp Saturday morning of the fishing reopening, a small crowd gathered at the lakeshore. The older couple, longtime fishers, were honored with the first cast. Their line sailed into the water, and after a few moments, the woman hooked a small bluegill. She cradled it gently, tears in her eyes, then released it back with a whispered, "Thank you." The group applauded softly, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I decided to cast a line as well. It felt symbolic. After all the chaos, stepping forward to fish again signified hope and renewed harmony. I reeled in a modest perch, grinning as I admired its shimmering scales. Carefully, I returned it to the lake, grateful for the chance to see nature's resilience firsthand. That day, neighbors mingled happily, trading fishing tips, snapping pictures, and remarking on how good it felt to see rods bobbing near the docks. Kayakers paddled by at a respectful distance, sipping hot coffee from thermoses. Children dangled their feet off the dock, listening to animated stories from older residents about how fishing was always part of the community spirit. Several times, I found myself reflecting on Karen's misguided attempt to banish fishing. If she had simply followed the normal HOA processes or engaged the local environment office, she could have advocated for thoughtful guidelines. like catch and release or designated fishing hours, without harming a living ecosystem. Instead, her fanaticism led her to commit a felony. A painful lesson for her, and a poignant lesson for us all. Fear or hatred of a recreational activity can never justify an environmental crime. The day ended with a low-key potluck near the clubhouse. Residents hauled tables outside, layering them with homemade dishes. Ernie, though no longer board president, roasted a turkey and served it with a big grin, saying, "This is a thank you feast. Thank you to everyone who stood by our lake." Denise led a short toast. "Here's to a community that overcame tragedy and became stronger for it. And to the fish, may they thrive in peace." Glasses clinked, laughter filled the air, and the children chased each other around the lawn. For the first time in what felt like ages, Cypress Creek Estates was simply happy, and the lake, aglow in the late afternoon sun, seemed to shimmer in agreement. Winter descended upon Cypress Creek Estates, draping bare branches with frost and icing the shallow edges of the lake. Fishing paused naturally as the water chilled, but the knowledge that the lake was on a path to recovery warmed everyone's spirits. The board focused on routine neighborhood matters, finalizing budgets for snow removal and holiday lights. Without Karen's meddling, decisions happened smoothly, often with consensus. At the clubhouse's holiday party, neighbors exchanged small gifts, sang carols, and shared homemade cookies. Even in the festive bustle, a few folks reminisced about the past year. They spoke quietly of how the lake had almost become a casualty of one person's zealotry, and how the community had unified to restore it. I spent the holiday season catching up on family time. My siblings flew in from out of state, and we spent a few days in my cozy living room, sipping hot cocoa and chatting about my surprisingly eventful year in what was supposed to be a tranquil suburb. They were stunned by the story, and my younger brother joked, "Leave it to you to pick a neighborhood where the biggest polluter is an HOA lady named Karen." Still, they admired the bright outcome. "It shows you, even in the face of something awful, good people band together," my sister said, flipping through photos of the lake renewal day on my phone. She paused at a shot of me standing with Ernie and Denise by the water, the sign behind us proclaiming, "Protect it with care." As the new year approached, the lake glistened under a thin sheet of ice in parts, but no longer harbored dangerous toxins. The environment's resilience, combined with community determination, had led us to a place of cautious triumph. I felt immense pride in how everyone pitched in, from kids donating their allowance to the older residents forging alliances with county experts. Karen's sentencing had become final, and updates trickled in. She was officially serving her term, expected to be released the following autumn if she behaved well. Whether she'd set foot in Cypress Creek Estates again was anyone's guess. The house remained on the market, though prospective buyers were understandably hesitant, given the property's notorious backstory. Some real estate agent might eventually spin it as the site of a famously resolved environmental incident, but for the time being, it sat empty. Looking out my window at the quiet, snow-dusted street, I reflected on how I'd come here for peace, only to land in a tempest. Yet in the end, we found justice for the lake, reaffirming why I devoted my life to environmental protection. Not all stories end on such a hopeful note, but here in Cypress Creek, we'd seized the chance to rebuild, together. When spring arrived, the lake's thaw revealed signs of renewed life. The stocked fish that survived winter stirred beneath the surface, occasionally rippling the water. Shoreline plants sprouted fresh green shoots, and wild birds resumed their patterns around the neighborhood's beloved water. A pair of mallard ducks nested in the reeds, a welcome sight after the previous year's destruction. Denise and the rest of the HOA board continued to organize community-driven projects aimed at boosting ecological awareness. They invited county specialists to host mini lectures on pollinator gardens, rainwater management, and ethical fishing practices. People attended in larger numbers than one might expect for educational gatherings. Perhaps the poisoning incident had awakened an appreciation for environmental stewardship that extended beyond just the lake. At one such event, an older resident approached me, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, handing me a homemade pie. "You saved our community when it was in crisis." I'm not sure we ever properly acknowledged that. I accepted the pie with a humbled smile. Honestly, we all saved the community. Everyone pitched in. I just happened to have some knowledge and resources. She shook her head gently. We needed a leader who truly understood what was at stake. You were that leader. She patted my arm and walked away, leaving me quietly touched by the sentiment. On a Saturday, Ernie and I took a canoe out onto the lake to check water clarity and see the newly growing aquatic plants firsthand. The water was cool, but once we paddled away from the shore, we glimpsed small schools of fish darting below. Ernie tapped the canoe's side with his paddle. We came so close to losing this, he murmured. We did, I agreed softly. But we fought back. He fixed me with a thoughtful gaze. I've lived here for a decade, and I never felt the power of community as strongly as I have this past year. It's a strange blessing. Karen's sabotage forced us all to unify. We learned how valuable this lake really is. I nodded. And you learned the importance of an HOA that listens to real science rather than one person's agenda. We both chuckled, the tension of the previous year somehow distant as we glided across the placid water. Later, from the canoe, we watched a heron snatch a small fish near the shallows. For a moment, it felt like nature had fully reclaimed the lake, reestablishing a balance that no single misguided individual could permanently upset. My heart lifted, grateful for the natural world's capacity to rebound, and for neighbors who cherished it enough to help. A full year after the poisoning, Cypress Creek Estates stood as a testament to resilience and hope. Where once there was fear, suspicion, and heartbreak, now we found renewed life. The fish population had grown steadily, aided by ecological management and a mild winter. The water, frequently tested, boasted healthy oxygen levels. People strolled and fished with gentle caution, abiding by posted guidelines that balanced recreation with responsible stewardship. The final symbolic milestone arrived on a bright summer morning. Denise, now well into her role as HOA president, organized a grand reopening of the lake. Residents gathered under colorful banners proclaiming, "Celebrate our lake's recovery." There were homemade pastries, iced drinks, and a small stage set up for speeches. Denise addressed the crowd, her voice ringing with pride. "Thank you, everyone, for coming together in the past year. Your spirit, your hard work, your devotion to making this lake better than ever." She waved me forward to the podium. I wasn't one for public speaking in a casual setting, but the neighbors cheered me on. Clearing my throat, I began. I moved to Cypress Creek Estates hoping for peace and natural beauty. I never expected the challenge that befell us. But in that dark time, I saw the best of what a community can be. We overcame sabotage and environmental harm through unity, empathy, and real science-based restoration. Applause rippled through the crowd. I continued, feeling a well of gratitude. Let us remember that true environmental protection isn't about imposing one person's will. It's about listening to experts, neighbors, and the natural world itself. Together, we've turned a crisis into a chance to learn and grow, and for that, I'm deeply thankful. With that, the final piece of a commemorative plaque was unveiled near the shore. Cypress Creek Lake, in honor of the community's dedication to restoration. May we always value the life we share here. It felt like the perfect encapsulation of the journey we'd taken, marked not by the name of the saboteur, but by the spirit of those who rebuilt the lake. Onlookers dabbed at their eyes, couples held hands, children grinned as they gazed at the shimmering water. At day's end, as people packed up lawn chairs and leftover pastries, I cast a line into the lake one more time. The reel clicked, and a small bass tugged at the lure, a sign that the fish population was indeed bouncing back. After a brief tussle, I gently released the fish into the water, watching it disappear into the depths. Standing there under a warm sun, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace and accomplishment. In a neighborhood once overshadowed by the destructive obsession of an HOA Karen, a new chapter had begun, one in which nature thrived, families bonded, and the water once again sparkled with health and life. This was the happy ending we'd all fought so hard to achieve.